What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy and welcome back to another set review here on the channel, and this time we are taking a look at the new mini set Shining Legends. So in the past we really haven't given too much coverage to these mini sets, especially in the case of Generations from last year. You know, there weren't too many playable cards and it was a lot of reprints and just honestly wasn't worth making the video, to be honest. But Shining Legends, on the other hand, I actually think is a very solid mini set. It's about 70 to 80 cards, so it's a decent size, and there's actually some pretty playable stuff in this set worth talking about. So that's why we decided to actually cover this one. And normally Marcus from the channel helps me out with these set reviews. We normally, tag team them together, but he's actually been working completely crazy hours, working 3 jobs, so we just weren't able to coordinate to make that happen. So I will have to take this one, by myself, but I think I'll be able to handle it. And actually, if you guys want to help us go more full-time with the channel, definitely visit our Patreon. We'll have a link in the description. That would greatly help us out in going more full-time with the channel to deliver videos at a more constant pace. But anyways, going on to the actual set review, we have Shining Legends. It's the newest Sun and Moon set, and kind of the big thing with this set is that they have brought back the old Shining Pokemon mechanic that used to exist around the time of Neo Destiny and Neo Revelations. That's kind of the big hook to this set. But in addition to that, we still have plenty of normal cards. We still have some GXs, some full arts, all sorts of regular cards in addition to that. But let's take a look at the set and see what is worth exploring. So the first Pokemon on our list that we're going to be taking a look at is going to be Venusaur. And if I'm not mistaken, this is actually our first regular Venusaur we've had since Dark Explorers, which was a pretty long time ago. I think all the other ones we've had since have been EXs. So definitely nice to have Venusaur back in its normal Stage 2 form, the way he should be. So 160 hit points, pretty solid for a Stage 2 in this day and age, but the reason we're looking at this card is for its ability, Lord of the Jungle. So each basic grass energy attached to your Pokemon provides 2 grass energy instead, and this ability does not stack. So basically what that means is if you have 1 grass energy attached to your Pokemon, you get 2 instead. So definitely a nice ability. We've seen this pop up over the years, even going as far back as the old Meganium from Neo Genesis. I believe there was a Sceptile in the Diamond and Pearl format that had this. We've seen Gardevoir from Next Destinies provide the same ability for Psychic Pokemon, so this is not a new mechanic by any means, but nice to have back since it is kind of lacking in the current format. So this is nice because if we have some grass Pokemon in the format with some obnoxious attack costs, Venusaur can help out with that, and there's actually a Shining Genesect in the set, which we'll get to in just a little bit, that Venusaur could potentially help out with. And, one thing that's also worth noting with this ability is that it is not exclusive to grass Pokemon, at least not in the translation that I'm reading. So what that means is for Pokemon with colorless attacks, or, colorless Pokemon, or Pokemon that don't even need grass energy, this ability still works for. So take something like a Celebi GX, just for example. Its attack only requires colorless energy, and even though it is a Psychic type, Venusaur will still be able to help out the Tapu Lele and provide more energy. So I think players might even be able to get a little creative with this card. Some other partners that come to mind for me are actually some Mega Pokemon that are in the format. The first of which is going to be Mega Beedrill EX, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Beedrill is still in our standard format. If not, I apologize, but he still isn't expanded, so we can still talk about him. So in the past, Mega Beedrill has had kind of a solid attack. 2 grass energy does 40 damage, and then you discard all of your energy, and it poisons and paralyzes your opponent's active, and they take some extra damage in between turns. So in the past, this attack has been kind of good, but very hard to stream throughout the course of a game, forcing you to have 2 energy every single turn. But with something like a Venusaur, you only need 1 more grass energy every turn, which makes the attack a lot more manageable. So that's actually a combo I'm very, very curious to try out. I think that might be a lot of fun. Another potential partner could actually be Mega Venusaur. Mega Venusaur has a similarly decent attack, does 120 damage, and then it paralyzes and poisons your opponent's active. So solid damage, solid effect, but the problem with Mega Venusaur is it took 4 energy, so kind of a lot. So with the regular Venusaur, you only need 2 energy to do 120 with auto paralysis and poison. Pretty decent, at least on paper. So just a couple of ideas to throw out there. for Venusaur, but definitely a card I would say keep an eye out on, and one that I expect to be good at some point. And speaking of Venusaur, we'll actually talk about the Shining Genesect that I briefly mentioned. So this is going to be one of the new Shining Pokemon that has been introduced into the set. So one thing that's important to note is that the official name of the Pokemon is Shining Genesect. So what that means is you can have 4 normal Genesects and 4 Shining Genesects in the same deck if need be. But anyways, onto the actual card. It has this ability, Energy Reload. Once during your turn before you attack, you may move a Grass Energy from one of your Pokemon to this Pokemon, and then to attack Gaia Blaster for 3 colorless energy, does 50, plus 20 more for each grass energy attached to this Pokemon. So if you've been playing for a while, this card actually might look very familiar. It's essentially just a grass version of Flareon EX. One thing that's nice about Shining Genesect though is that it's only a 1 prize attacker. You know, it has a little bit less HP, only has 130 hit points compared to Flareon, for example, but nevertheless, I definitely think this card still has some potential, especially with the Venusaur we just mentioned. So the idea is you want to max Elixir a bunch and put a bunch of energy onto this Genesect, and then you get out Venusaur and basically double all of the energy you have in play to hit for large amounts of damage. So the fact that all of the main components of the deck are going to be 1 prize Pokemon, I think that really sets up this archetype to potentially have some, potential. So on paper, at first glance, I like this Shining Genesect. We'll have to wait and see how good it actually is, but I think at the very least it will be a decent card. So for that reason, I'm going to say Genesect is good. Probably be on the lookout for it. So up next we have yet another Shining Pokemon. This one's going to be Shining Celebi, and one thing that is worth noting is Celebi does not actually officially release it in the set. It was actually withheld from the international release and is going to be included as a promo in the upcoming Ho-Oh like Super Premium Collection, I think it is. So you won't be able to get Celebi in packs, but it is going to be released as part of the product line for this set. But anyways, so Shining Celebi, I am happy to see this card. Celebi, I've mentioned before, is one of my favorite Pokemon from any generation. And the card's actually kind of decent, so that makes me even more happy to see this guy actually pop up. So it has this ability, Time Recall. As long as this Pokemon is in play, each of your evolved Pokemon can use any attacks from its previous evolutions, but you still need the correct energy to use each attack. So this might look pretty familiar if you've been playing for a while. There was actually a Celebi Ex back from Boundaries Cross that had basically the same ability. Celebi Ex only saw very small amounts of play due to it being a low HP EX that gave up 2 prizes, but nevertheless it still managed to pop up in a couple decks, during its time in the game, most notably the Metacham deck. But even still, so I think that card kind of saw a smaller degree of play because of how fragile it is, but since Celebi, or Shining Celebi I should say, only gives up 1 prize, I think you will be able to include a copy of this card much more easily than you would have Celebi EX. So really the quality of this ability though is really only as strong as the attacks on pre-evolutions in the game. So you might be thinking, well, why would you ever want to use your pre-evolutions attacks? Isn't that the whole point of evolving? Like, you want to use your attacks and stuff on newer Pokemon. Well, yes, that might be the case, just generally speaking, but let's just, for example, take a look at Alolan Ninetales GX. Very, very solid card. It's a deck that's had decent success, won Worlds in Seniors, just as an example. But I think even more impressive than Alolan Ninetales GX is Alolan Vulpix, which has managed to pop up even in decks that don't run Alolan Ninetales GX, just because how strong its first attack beacon is. So for example, if you were playing an Alolan Ninetales GX deck, you could actually play 1 copy of this Shining Celebi to still make use of that beacon attack to search your deck for some Pokemon. So that's just a very easy example to understand. There's so many cards in the format, we could probably do an entire video just dedicated to all of the different combinations for Shining Celebi alone, but I do like this ability. For the moment, I don't see any glaring immediate uses for this. Maybe if you wanted to revive the Mega Mewtwo archetype, I think this would be an option, just because in the past players used to run Shrine of Memories, which was a stadium that did the same thing in their Mega Mewtwo decks to abuse that damage change attack. Since that card is now gone from standard format, you could opt to try to play that with Shining Celebi. So that's an option, but really, I don't think there's any decks that are really screaming for this ability. So it's one I I like the ability, but for right now, I would say keep an eye out on this card. You know, this ability is really only as good as the pre-evolutions that we have in play, like I said earlier, so definitely keep an eye out for it, but Shining Celebi could pop up in the future. So next up we have a new Virizion we're going to look at. So Virizion is a 110 hit point basic Pokemon, has this attack Wrapped in Wind for 1 grass energy, does 30 damage, and you may attach a basic grass energy from your hand to this Pokemon. So actually kind of a decent little attack, very similar to the Oblivion Wing that we've seen on Yveltal in the past, which has been, you know, solid. And, you know, it's worth mentioning if you have a Choice Band, you do 60 damage as well, and you power yourself up. So not a bad first attack. And then its other attack, Long Spear for 2 grass energy, and a colorless does 90, and this attack does 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Don't apply weakness and resistance. So this attack actually might look extremely familiar. This is basically just Night Spear on the old Darkrai EX from Dark Explorers, but for grass Pokemon essentially. Same attack cost, just with grass energy. You know, Darkrai was I'd say the best attacker debatably in the game for several sets because of that attack. You know, granted this was many years ago in the 2012-2013 format, so things have changed a lot. But you know, I still think this attack is kind of decent. If you have a Choice Band, you're doing 120 and 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And right now in the current format at the time of filming, you know, the format is very dominated by these low HP, you know, basic evolving decks like Gardevoir GX, you know, Gliscod GX, Metagross GX. So everything is evolving from low HP basics, and something in a format like that, this attack is actually kind of decent. So it powers itself up, you know, it's 110 hit points on a basic, which is decent in this day and age. It's only a 1 prize Pokemon. You could play this debatably in a Tapu Bulu style deck, or maybe a Lurantis deck, or maybe if we're going to play like that Genesect style deck that we just mentioned, this could be an inclusion as well, maybe as a one-of. But, you know, I think this card has some stuff going for it. It's a basic. You can max elixir to it. It just overall seems solid. You know, nothing about it screams, you know, groundbreaking or broken or anything like that. But, you know, everything about it just seems pretty well-rounded. It might be debatably too balanced to really break into the format, but I like the card. It's one that I would say keep an eye out on. It might serve as a decent one of or two of in certain decks, but you know, like I said, I'm just going to say wait and see on this one, but it is a card I am optimistic about. So moving on to the fire types in the set, the first one we're going to look at is going to be Reshiram. And so Reshiram and Zekrom are both in this mini set, and they're actually very similar to the old ones back from the black and white era. But unfortunately, don't let nostalgia fool you. These cards are not as good as their black and white counterparts. Not because the cards printed are especially worse, but it's just a different format than it was back in 2011 and 2012. And I think these cards might be a little outclassed. But let's see what we're actually talking about. So what I mean when I'm comparing them to these old black and white counterparts is that they were famous for this Outrage Attack. For just a DCE, it does 20 plus 10 more for each damage counter on this Pokemon, and that's kind of the main thing that carried these Pokemon to success. Also, 130 hit points back then was insane on a basic, which is a little bit weird to say now in this age. So unfortunately, those are the first strikes it has going against. 130 hit points is still solid on a basic, but only on a non-GX basic. So now we have Pokemon with way more HP than that, and so in 2017, this amount of hit points is not quite as good, and especially when the attack that it has is reliant on it having damage counters. So a lot of Pokemon can knock this Reshiram out pretty easily. Gardevoir can easily knock this out, Metagross can easily knock this out, Tapu Bulu, etc, etc. So a lot of the time you won't even get a chance to use this Outrage Attack, at least not to its fullest potential. But then its other attack, Burning Breath for 2 fire and a colorless is 130, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. And, you know, fire Pokemon does have a decent amount of support. There is the Baby Volcanion, there's Max Elixirs, Kiawe, etc. But really this card I think is just outclassed at the end of the day. So you might be thinking, well, you know, 2 fire and a colorless does 130, you know, Volcanion EX has the same attack basically. And Volcanion gives up 2 prizes, so why would you not want to play Reshiram instead? Well, the reason for that is Volcanion EX has Steam Up. So it can boost its own damage output up much higher to take one-hit knockouts. It also is part water type, which allows it to hit other fire Pokemon for weakness as well. And yeah, Volcanion is just a little bit better. And if you're looking for a one prize attacker in a fire deck, Volcanion already has it with the baby Volcanion, since it can do 100 for 3 energy, which is a little bit less to be fair. But if you're playing Volcanion EX, you can, boost up its damage output, and also, most importantly, it has Power Heater to accelerate energy as well. So unfortunately, I think Reshiram might just be a little bit outclassed in this current day and age. I think it's easy to put on nostalgia glasses and see that this card might be good, but unfortunately, I would say it's probably not so good in today's format. So the next card on our list we are taking a look at is going to be Incineroar. And honestly, this card's not that good, but we are mainly looking at for its attack. And that's kind of the big controversy behind this card when it was first revealed. Its first attack is called God Damn Punch. Absolutely insane attack name. I wish Pokemon would have kept this name for this attack. Pokemon will never let an attack be called this here in the States, or probably most other places internationally as well. But it would just be hilarious to be at a tournament and say, God damn punch. So, unfortunately, we probably won't be able to ever get to announce that at a tournament. But I guess while we're on the topic of it, let's at least look at Incineroar and see what he's all about. So the first thing you might notice, it has 170 hit points. So one thing I've been noticing over the past set or two is that these non-GX, non-EX Pokemon have been kind of creeping up in HP. Incineroar has 170. There's a Raichu GX coming out in Crimson Invasion that has 160. So HP is definitely going up. I'm guessing to combat the, all of the powerful GX Pokemon. So I guess that makes sense. But anyways, let's look at him. 170 hit points, like I said, very solid. And God Punch for a fire and colorless is 50 plus 80 if any of your Pokemon have damage counters on them. So this might look very familiar. It's very similar to the attack on Drampa GX. And it does cost a little bit less, only requires 2 energy, whereas Drampa needs 3. But unfortunately, I just don't think this is very good, because Drampa is a basic and Incineroar is a stage 2, which commits a lot more deck space to it. And even though Drampa takes 3 energy, it only takes 2 energy attachments to actually power it up. So a double colorless and any other energy of your choice, basically. So Drampa can be powered up just as easily as an Incineroar, but it also does more damage as well. It has that nice Righteous Edge attack, and it also has a solid GX move as well. So unfortunately, I would just have to say Drampa is overall better. I think the numbers for Incineroar are just too awkward. So if you can fulfill the attack cost, you are doing 130. With a choice band, that's 160, but the problem is that doesn't really knock out anything too easily. If this was 180 base damage, without a choice band, I would say, hey, there might be a case to run Incineroar, because 180 is a very important number to hit for. 210 is also very important to hit for. But unfortunately, Incineroar just is not that good. You would actually think that the stage 2 version of this attack would be better than the basic one. That would make sense, but unfortunately, Incineroar kind of got the shaft here. And unfortunately, I don't see this card being much of anything other than a discussion piece for its first attack. So we have our first GX of our set review, and that is going to be Entei GX. So the legendary dogs are finally getting some GX representation. I'm sure a lot of people are excited for that. But unfortunately, from a competitive standpoint, I can't get too excited about this card. So 180 hit points, weak to water, 2 retreat, all fine and dandy. But let's look at its attacks. Ember for a fire and colorless is 50. Not that great. I will say this one thing fire decks are lacking is an attacker that only requires 2 energy, because currently they all either take 1 or 3. So Entei could potentially be a decent mid-game attacker. But even with a choice band, 2 for 80, it's just not that It's just not that good. If this was 2 energy for 80, I might be a little bit more enthusiastic, but it just doesn't hit for good numbers. That's my problem. Even 2 energy for 60 would be decent because then you could knock out low evolving basics. So the first attack, strike 1. Next attack is going to be Fire Fang for 2 fire and a colorless, does 100 damage, and then your opponent's active is now burned. So if you count the damage your opponent takes from burn, they're basically taking 120. If you have a choice band, they're taking 150. My problem with this is that it's just the numbers are very awkward. 150 is not a good amount to hit for. 120 is fine just because you two-shot everything. But if you're going to commit, I guess, the choice band to this thing, you would want it to actually, make a difference in terms of going from a 2-hit knockout to a 1-hit knockout. And it just doesn't do that. So that's my problem with this attack. Volcanion EX also does more damage for the same attack cost. It can also power itself up with its own ability. Turtonator GX, and Ho-Oh GX can also hit for more damage than this as well. So that's strike 2. But maybe there's, some hope. So let's look at the GX move. It has, for the same attack cost, 2 fire and a colorless, has Brave Blitz. This attack does 150 to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. But the problem is, like I just mentioned, 150 is just not a great number to hit for because you're basically 20 or 30 damage shy of knocking out basic GXs. You're definitely short of knocking out, stage 1, stage 2 GXs. Granted, you can knock out one prize attackers and things of that nature, which is fine. But, if it's your GX move, I really wouldn't want to use my GX move to get only one prize. You can only use one of these per game, so you really want either a move that's going to get you 2 prizes or is going to set up your board, so effectively that you can carry out the rest of the game. That's typically, what these GX moves have done before. They're either extremely aggressive and you can take big knockouts with them, you can set up your board, or they're incredibly defensive like an Alolan Ninetales or something like that. So Entei GX, I just really don't see this. I don't really care for this GX move. I do think it is the best attribute of this card because right now in current Fire decks, they don't really have a means of sniping the bench. So that is one area where Entei actually could provide some additional coverage, is giving it a sniping option. But the thing is, most of the time you would just prefer to use Nitro Tank GX with your Turtonators. Turtonator can already hit for a lot more damage, and it also has a lot better recovery with its attack, or its GX attack as well. But, I'm going to be a little optimistic here. Maybe in the future, if we get another GX that gets printed similar to Shaman, like a low HP GX that's a great support Pokemon that every deck plays, this attack might actually get some more value because then you could snipe, something for an easy 2 prizes. So I think Entei is a card I would keep an eye out for, or kind of just keep in mind when you're building your Fire decks, just as time goes on. But I think at the time of filming, I just think it's overall just outclassed in every way by the existing options that Fire decks have. But like I said, to end on an optimistic note, it provides, one extra tool to Fire archetypes that they might want to consider using at some point. But for right now, I just think it's not quite good enough. So next up we have our first water Pokemon of the set, and that is going to be a new basic Manaphy. So Manaphy, we're looking at for its ability Deep Sea Blessing. Once during your turn, you may heal 20 damage from one of your Pokemon that has a water energy attached to it. So, ever since the rotation, I think water players have been kind of lamenting, the loss of Rough Seas, which previously helped out water decks to heal, but now we have Manaphy as a potential replacement to help out water decks in that regard. So, if you are playing like a water toolbox deck or something like that, having maybe one Manaphy, for example, could make the difference between getting knocked out on certain turns or turning, 2-hit KOs into 3-hit KOs and things of that nature. And it is worth noting this ability does stack. So theoretically, if you have 4 Manaphy in play, you can heal 80 damage every turn from one of your Pokemon that has water energy attached to it. Now, do I think you should play 4 Manaphy in your deck? Probably not if you ever want to win, but you do have the option. I do think this card could potentially pop up as a one of maybe in like a Water Toolbox style deck, or maybe even a Alolan Ninetales, this could be a good card to counter something like Tapu Koko, which normally spreads a lot of damage to set up knockouts. So I think maybe if there's a deck in the current format that abuses Tapu Koko, or some of these cards that soften up Pokemon to set up knockouts with, if your deck struggles against those types of archetypes, I would maybe consider playing one of these Manaphy to, you know, kind of take that play away from your opponent. Now, the only thing I don't really care for this card in comparison with Rough Seas is that it only heals damage from one Pokemon, and it has to have water energy attached to it. Whereas Rough Seas healed 30 from all of your water and lightning Pokemon, even if they did not have energy. So I don't think this is a great replacement to Rough Seas, but nevertheless it does kind of fill that void that players I think have been missing a little bit ever since the rotation. So, you know, Manaphy, I'm not blown away by this card, but I would say keep an eye out for it. Like I said, there might be some situations as the metagame shifts where you might need to heal off, you know, that little bit of extra damage that your opponent might try to get on the board to set up knockouts with. So next up we have yet another legendary Pokemon. We have Keldeo, 110 hit point basic Pokemon. Its first attack is Rescue. For 1 colorless energy, put a water Pokemon from your discard into your hand. Not the best attack. You know, we have Rescue Stretcher, does the same thing, and it lets us get back any Pokemon, so I'm not too ecstatic about this Rescue attack. You never know, though. There might be some situations where it does come in handy. Maybe you Sycamored away a Tapu Lele at some point, or it got knocked out. You could use Rescue to get that back to reactivate its ability or something like that, but most of the time, if you are playing Keldeo, you're going to want to play it for its second attack. That's for its Determined Horn attack for 2 water energy. It is 20 plus 20 more for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So if your opponent has a full bench, you're going to be doing 120 damage, and most of the time in this current format at the time of filming, I think your opponent normally does have a full or close to full bench, just because most of the most popular decks right now are setup decks that require, you know, lots of low HP basics on the field at a time to set up their board. There's also Tapu Lele and all sorts of other support Pokemon that clog up your opponent's field these days as well. So I think hitting for 100 and 120 before factoring in things like Choice Band is pretty doable. And, you know, that's solid actually. You know, 2 energy for 120 on a 1 prize attacker. Not too bad. You know, water also has a ton of support in the form of Aqua Patch. Keldeo is a basic, so it can abuse things like Max Elixir as well. So you never know. Keldeo might potentially fit into like a Water Toolbox style deck. You know, right now, when I'm really thinking about all of the options for Water Box, it doesn't really have any 1 prize attackers that it can really abuse. You know, the ones that it previously favored before rotation were Articuno and Regice, but like I said, they have rotated out of the format, and now all of the big attackers for the archetype are going to be GXs and EXs. So I think Keldeo kind of fills a void that the Water Box deck has been missing. So this card I could see very well popping up as a one of. I don't think it's a great card by any means, but I would say keep an eye out for it. It might fit nicely into your Water Box style decks. So yeah, maybe pick up 1 or 2 of this one just in case. And so next up we have our next Shining Pokemon we're going to be looking at. It's going to be Shining Volcanion. This is actually, I believe, our first pure water type Volcanion that we've had. All the other ones have been fire type. And of course, well, I guess if you want to be technical, the one from Steam Siege is part water type. I think most people, first and foremost, consider it a fire type. But anyways, getting on with Shining Volcanion, it's 130 hit point basic. And, you know, the question is, does it live up to the same, you know, bar of quality that its fire counterpart set? And I think the answer is no, unfortunately. So let's take a look at it. So its first attack, Dual Pump for 3 water energy, does 50 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. And then its second attack, Quad Smash for 4 colorless energy, flip 4 coins, its attack is 50, times the number of heads. So let's get the bad out of the way first and foremost. Quad Smash. This attack is so terrible, I don't know where to begin. Well, actually, I know exactly where to begin. It's bad. It's a coin flip attack. It takes a ton of energy. That is why the attack is bad. But, you know, you might be saying, well, hey, if you flip 4 coins, you're doing 200. You're doing 230 if you have a choice band, so you're knocking out Gardevoir in one hit. Well, that may well be true, but you can also do 0 damage. Most of the time, statistically, you're only going to be hitting for about 100 damage, maybe 130 if you have a choice band. But 100 for 4 energy is just not good. There's so many other Pokemon that can hit way above that number for far less. So I think we have to rule out this second attack as the reason we would want to play this. The other reason we might want to play it is for its first attack though. And that's going to be Dual Pump, like I said, 50 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. But for 3 water, if this was 2 water to do 50 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon, I'd be a little bit more enthusiastic. But for 3 energy though, I think it just makes the attack far too, not far, but just a little too costly to warrant playing this. Just because 3 energy, for the same attack cost, you could do 160 damage with a Lapras GX, or 190 if you have a choice band, for example. And I think most of the time, most players would prefer to do that. But the other reason I don't like this attack is because it just hits for awkward numbers. If this attack was 60 to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon, I would actually be very interested in this. And that might seem kind of petty to just, write this card off because of 10 damage, but it's actually pretty important because most of the game's low evolving basics currently have 60 hit points. So if we could potentially take out 2 of them with just 1 attack, this would be, I think, pretty balanced. It would take 3 energy, which is a decent amount to ask for, but in return, you can actually do decent damage. I would be excited about this card, but unfortunately, I just think the numbers it hits for are far too awkward and far too low for what the attack cost actually is. But you never know. As the game develops, there might be some new Pokemon that come into the game that do have 50 hit points that Shining Volcanion could potentially pick off. But until that point, I can't say I'm that excited. If you're wanting to soften up your opponent's board, I think a much more effective way to do that is with the Tapu Koko promo. For just 1 DCE, you can do 20 to everything. So I think just for the moment, that is the way I think players should probably go if they want to soften up their opponent's board. But like I said, maybe down the road there might be some Pokemon that are worth hitting for 50 damage for this attack cost. The one thing it does have going for it is that it is a basic water Pokemon, so it can abuse Max Elixir and Aqua Patch to help power it up. But like I said, I just don't see the reason to power it up at the moment. So moving on to the Lightning Pokemon, we have my boy Raichu GX, one of my favorite all-time Pokemon. And Marcus from the channel, he's a big fan of Pikachu as well, so we are always excited to see the Pika line get printed in the cards. So Raichu GX, like I said, one of my more favorite cards from this set. So 210 hit points on a Stage 1 GX, pretty standard at this point. But its main attack we are going to be taking a look at is Powerful Spark. For 2 colorless energy, it does 20 plus 20 more for every lightning energy attached to all of your Pokemon in play. So this is very similar to the Darkrai EX that we currently have in the game, but for lightning Pokemon, same exact attack. So the idea is if you can manage to swarm a bunch of energy onto your field, you can hit for large amounts of damage. And luckily for Raichu, lightning actually has a ton of support. Of course there's Max Elixirs and, things like that to accelerate to your basic Pokemon, but we also have Electrode to knock himself out and attach him as 2 lightning energy to your Pokemon. We have Magnezone that lets you attach as many lightning energy as you want from your hand to your Pokemon. And then even in the expanded format, we have Electric to accelerate lightning energy from your discard pile. So Raichu, I think, has a ton of support. I would be extremely surprised if someone didn't figure out a proper way to run this card. But I think just at first glance there is a ton of support for him, and there's actually even a Raikou, which we'll talk about in just a second, that will give him even more support. But let's look at the rest of the card. So its next attack is Thunder. For 2 lightning and a colorless energy, it does 160, and then this Pokemon does 30 damage to itself. So not quite as good, I don't think. Doing damage to yourself is never that fun, especially if you're knocking yourself down to 180 hit points. That's actually pretty bad because a lot of decks can easily one-shot you. As sad as that is. But Gardevoir GX will have no problem knocking out something that has 180 hit points. Similarly, Metagross usually runs a high count of Choice Bands to do 180. Golisopod can do 180 with its GX move. So I'm not a huge fan of this attack, but I'm sure there's situations where you will need to use Thunder to clean up a knockout. And then its last attack, Volt Tackle GX for 2 lightning and a colorless, does 120 damage, and your opponent's active is now paralyzed. So, we've seen a move like this in the past on Lapras GX, which only did 100 damage, so this is a nice little damage boost from that. But recently the status inflicting GX move, or just moves in general I should say, lost a little bit of value since Guzma is so prevalent in the current format. And then also too, a lot of decks run Acerola, so I think there are ways for your opponent to deal with this, but you never know. This paralyzing your opponent might force them to play a suboptimal supporter for the turn. So maybe they really needed to play a Sycamore that turn to draw cards. Well, you might actually force them to play something like a Guzma or Acerola to avoid being knocked out. So even if your opponent does have to play, one of these cards I just mentioned, it might still set them back. So you might be forcing your opponent into awkward plays, but even still, it's a solid move. Your opponent isn't going to have a Guzma or Acerola every time that you use this attack, so this is definitely a decent GX move. I have no problems with it. But like I said, the main attack we're looking at is going to be that first attack, Powerful Spark. So since this is from the Pikachu evolution line, that means you also can run other things in the deck, like one of the many Raichus that are in the current format. You have the one that does 20 times the amount of Pokemon you have in play. You have one that can snipe your opponent from Breakthrough, I believe it is. Then there's also the one from Burning Shadows that can paralyze your opponent. So like I said, Raichu has a ton of support, and I'm very excited to see which route people choose to take this card, because I think there's a lot of different ways you could build a deck around this guy. But Raichu GX, I would say definitively a great card from the set, definitely one to pick up, I think. And like we just mentioned, there is a new Raikou in the set that will help Raichu GX even more. So let's look at this guy. 120 hit point basic, pretty solid. But the main attack we're going to be looking at here is going to be Roaring Thunder for 1 lightning energy, does 30 damage, and attach a lightning energy from your discard to one of your bench Pokemon. So this is very, very similar to the Yveltal with Oblivion Wing that we've had in the past, which has been played for many, many years now at this point, for its attack that does just that, 30, and attaches a dark energy. So same attack, but for lightning Pokemon, seems good. You can even play this in maybe decks like Tapu Koko GX and stuff like that as well if you really want to. So Raikou, I definitely like this card. I see it being a 1 or 2 of in certain lightning decks, so there's really not too much to say about it. It's just a pretty solid card that can help get energy on the field, especially with Raichu GX. You're trying to get as much energy on the field as possible, so Raikou definitely seems like a very natural partner for the Raichu GX deck. And we did mention the Reshiram earlier in the set review, so I think it's only fair that we mention Zekrom as well. It similarly has that Outrage Attack that made these dragons famous back in their black and white debut. 130 hit points, and then its other attack, Thunderblade, for 2 lightning and a colorless does 130, and you discard 2 energy attached to this Pokemon. So similarly to Reshiram, I just think Zekrom might be a little bit outclassed. 130 hit points and Outrage were great back in 2011 and 2012, but in today's format, it's just not quite good enough. And again, in the case of Zekrom, I think he's just outclassed by other Pokemon that are similar. So if you look at the Raikou from Breakthrough, 120 hit points, its ability reduces damage, and its attack has an unlimited damage cap. For 3 lightning energy, basically, you're doing 110, and you don't have to discard your energy. You can keep loading up even more energy to do more damage. You can make the case, though, that Zekrom might potentially be a better attacker against something like a Gardevoir GX, since you do discard your own energy, but generally speaking, Raikou I think will always be a more solid attacker, also has a lower retreat cost as well. So Zekrom, unfortunately, the things that made it so great back in the day just don't really hold true today, and its second attack, just like I said, just a little outclassed by other things that are already in the format. So unfortunately, I think Zekrom gets a thumbs down from us. Next up, we have Mewtwo finally making his GX debut in the card game. So we're going to be looking at Mewtwo GX. It's a basic Pokemon, of course. 190 hit points, very solid for a basic GX. But let's look at this guy. It has full burst for 1 psychic energy, does 30, times the amount of energy attached to this Pokemon. So this is very similar to the Shatter Shot Mewtwo back from Breakthrough. But of course this is GX, not the EX. Its next attack, Super Absorption, for a Psychic and Colorless, does 60 damage and heal 30 from this Pokemon. And then its GX move, Psycho Break, for 3 Psychic, does 200 damage and isn't affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. So unfortunately though, I'm just not too excited about this card. So its first attack, I think at first glance looks neat because, you know, it's a basic, it can abuse things like Max Elixir to get powered up more, but let's really do the math on this. If you have 3 Psychic Energy on Mewtwo, you're only doing 90 damage, or 120 if you have a Choice Band, but 3 for 90 is not good. That hasn't been very good in a while in the card game. And yes, you can make the argument that you can stack even more energy onto this Mewtwo, but unfortunately, it's just going to get knocked out by things like Gardevoir. Even Tapu Lele GX can respond pretty nicely if this Mewtwo does get a lot of energy committed to it. Its second attack, similarly, it's just not quite good enough. 2 energy for 60, and yes, you do heal 30, but just the damage to energy ratio is just not great. If this was 1 energy for 60, I would be actually pretty enthusiastic. Or if this was maybe 2 energy to do 90, I would be enthusiastic. But it's just not worth the energy to damage ratio that it has. But I will be much more optimistic about its GX move. Psycho Break is very, very nice. 3 energy for 200 is great. You're going to get one-hit knockouts a lot of the time with this. If you have a Choice Band, you're even going to knock out things like Stage 1 GXs, Fighting Fury belted, basic EXs and GXs, and also you can knock out Gardevoir GX. So I definitely like its GX move. You can power it up easily thanks to Max Elixirs, but just the rest of the card just doesn't have enough going for it. I hate to say, I don't think you could build an entire deck around this Mewtwo. One thing that could potentially be good is maybe ever if the Lunala archetype becomes a thing at some point, you could play this as a one-of just to abuse the GX move, maybe move all your energy to Mewtwo to take a big knockout that way. That's really the only thing I can think of, off the top of my head. I just think there's so many other attackers that are better than this. It's also weak to Psychic as well. So if you're going to play a Pokemon like this that needs a lot of energy on itself to do more damage, I'd rather just play Tapu Lele GX, has a similar first attack, and also has no weakness, and nets you a supporter whenever you play it. So I would much rather play Tapu Lele over this Mewtwo, again, unless you're playing some sort of energy manipulation deck, where you can kind of change gears out of nowhere and take a knockout, or if you play a deck with Ninja Boy, that might be a consideration as well. So I could see maybe in like a Drampa Garbodor deck or something like that, maybe you could potentially play Ninja Boy, or I don't know, just I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel trying to get ideas for this Mewtwo. But just overall, guys, I think you can see I'm just not a big fan of this. I like the GX move, but unfortunately we can't build the entire deck around taking 1 knockout in the whole game. We just can't do that. So unfortunately, I have to give Mewtwo a thumbs down. It hurts me to say, just because Mewtwo is a fan favorite. We all love him, and I just wish he would have been better represented as a GX. But there have been worse GXs, so it's not the end of the world. But maybe one day it'll be decent, but right now I just don't see it. So next up we have the other Mew Pokemon, and that is going to be Shining Mew. So the reason we are looking at this card is for its first attack, Legendary Guidance, for 1 Psychic Energy. Search your deck for 2 energy cards and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like, then shuffle your deck. So you could attach a Psychic Energy and search your deck for a couple more Psychic Energy to power up your field. I think that's worth noting just because Psychic at the time of filming doesn't have a whole lot of energy acceleration. But honestly, that is not the main reason why I want to mention this card. It's important to note that the text on this card says 2 energy cards, not 2 basic energy cards. So that means you can search your deck for even 2 rainbow energies, 2 double Karos energies, etc., etc. And so that's where I'm much more interested in this card, because if you notice, Mew only has 30 hit points. So you're going to waste 1 energy on this Mew to get 2 out of the deck. So you're effectively netting 1 energy for 1 prize card, which not the best trade-off. I really don't think. I don't think Mew is worth it for its ability to get basic energies out of the deck. I just don't like it. But special energies, like I said, are where things get more interesting. And there actually is a combo in particular that I want to mention. So in the upcoming set Crimson Invasion, there's actually a new energy card coming out that acts as 2 energy of any type if you are behind on prizes. So a combo I'm curious to try out is maybe find a Pokemon in the format that has kind of a difficult attack cost to fulfill, and use Mew to search your deck for 2 counter energy, put it on that Pokemon, and then whenever your Mew gets knocked out, because let's face it, it has 30 hit points, your counter energies will activate and suddenly provide you a ton of energy. So that is a situation that I actually like much better. Or like I said, in the instance of getting 2 double Karos energies out of your deck, I like that much better. But yeah, so Mew, I like this attack. I don't like how fragile it is, but I think the attack is interesting enough to where it's worth mentioning. At the time of filming, I don't see a really broken way to play this card, but you know, the card pool is really big. There might be a combo I am overlooking, but I would say keep an eye out for this card. It might make an impact on the game at some point. So next up we have yet another Shining Pokemon. That is going to be Shining Jirachi. So Shining Jirachi has this 1 attack, Star Determination for 1 Psychic Energy, 10 damage, and remove all evolution cards from your opponent's evolved active Pokemon and return those cards to your opponent's hand. So you might be looking at this and you might think, well, why would you ever want to play this? Espeon EX is already in the format. Doesn't that de-evolve Pokemon? And yes, while if that is what you're thinking, you are correct. Espeon will de-evolve Pokemon. An important distinction to make between this and Espeon is that Espeon only returns the highest stage back to your opponent's hand. Jirachi will de-evolve them all the way back down to the basic form. So if you're going against a stage 2 deck like Metagross or Gardevoir, it will de-evolve them all the way down to the basic Beldum or Ralts if they did evolve through Curlias and Metangs. So this is actually pretty important, because if you've played any of these like spread types of decks in the format that utilize Tapu Koko and Espeon EX, a lot of times you'll run into situations where it's like, man, if only my opponent had rare candied into the Metagross or the Gardevoir, I could just de-evolve them with Espeon and knock them out immediately. But since they evolve through the stage 1, I can't take a knockout. So Jirachi comes in handy in those situations. Now, it is worth noting, Jirachi only de-evolves the active Pokemon. You know, Espeon de-evolves all of your opponent's Pokemon. So Espeon, you know, if you're going for the spread route, maybe Espeon is the better way to go. But if you are not a spread deck, maybe let's say you're playing a Drampa Garbodor deck and you're hitting for, you know, let's just say 150 damage with your Drampas, or, you know, maybe 100-ish with your Garbodors mid-game. You know, something like that, an instance like that, Jirachi could actually be more beneficial because you've done enough damage to de-evolve even through the stage 1 and take a knockout that way. So that is kind of where I would see Jirachi coming into play. Or you never know, maybe if you're playing a spread deck that uses Psychic Energy in it, you might play one of Espeon and one of Jirachi. Who knows? But I definitely think Jirachi has its own pros and cons over Espeon that should make you at least consider Jirachi over Espeon in certain situations. So, you know, I might be a little bold for saying this, but I might say that this card is good. You know, I might, like I said, I think there's certain situations where this does outclass Espeon and vice versa. I think the style of deck you are playing will determine that, though. So up next, we actually have ourselves a new Latios card, and we're going to be mentioning this card for its first attack, Breakthrough. Just for a DCE, it does 30, and then 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon as well. So I think at first glance this might look kind of mediocre, you know, just 30 to the active, 30 to the bench. It's not too great, to be honest, but you know, there are some situations where this attack actually could be decent. So right now a lot of people do run the Tapu Koko promo in a lot of decks, it's just kind of nice because just for a single DCE, it spreads 20 to each of your opponent's Pokemon, and it can soften up things for some future knockouts. So Latios fills a similar role, but there's actually situations where Latios is a little bit better if your opponent only has maybe 2 or 3 Pokemon in play. Breakthrough is actually probably a little bit better, and also as far as like setting up like de-evolution plays with things like Espeon EX or the new Shining Jirachi, for example, I think Latios actually might be a little bit stronger because most of the basic pre-evolutions in the current format have 60 hit points. So that means if you wanted to de-evolve like a rare Candied Gardevoir or Stage 2 like that, you would need to use Flying Flip 3 times in order to make that happen. Whereas with something like Breakthrough, you only need to do it twice. So in certain situations, Latios, like I said, is superior to Tapu Koko. And the fact that it only requires a DCE still means that it's good against a variety of decks. The only downside is that it has a 1 retreat cost, whereas Tapu Koko has no retreat cost. So not a huge deal breaker, but definitely that is part of the appeal of Tapu Koko. Now there is a Latias coming out, I think as a promo or something like that, that will reduce your Latios' retreat cost, but I don't really think you're going to want to run a Latias just to give your 1 retreat Latios free retreat. Just doesn't seem that good. But nevertheless, I do like this attack, and like I said, in certain situations, this actually is better than Tapu Koko. Now, will people actually end up dropping their Tapu Kokos in favor of Latios? You know what, it's hard to say, but I think at the very least I would say keep an eye on this card. Like I said, I don't have a clear-cut idea if this is going to replace Tapu Koko, but definitely one to keep an eye out on as a potential option for your decks. So next up we have a new Spiritomb card. And so the reason we're looking at this is for its ability Cursed Vortex. If this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, the defending Pokemon can't retreat. And you guys might be thinking, well, that's kind of annoying, but is that really that good? And my answer is, it might be. So we have the Rockruff that's in format, and I've heard so many stories of this happening to people I know where, it looks like they were going to win the game, and then their opponent literally just used Corner on the basic Rockruff to prevent them from ever retreating, and they eventually lost because of that. So there's certain situations where just not being able to retreat has costed people the game, and there's even been an old deck in the 2013-14 format that abused the Plasma Snorlax. It was just Plasma Snorlax from what I remember, and it had the same ability. Granted, the whole deck was kind of a disruption deck, but the ability really made it very annoying. So where does Spiritomb fit in the format? And one idea I'm actually curious about is in Decidueye potentially, or basically any deck that can do damage or things like that from the bench without having to be in the active spot. So one thing you can do is you can Guzma up something with a big retreat cost, maybe like an Octillery just as an example, if we are playing the Decidueye deck, and you keep your Spiritomb active. And while it's in the active spot, use Decidueye to spread damage behind your opponent's active Pokemon. So I think this could be a decent potential tech for Decidueye decks going forward. You never know, I could just be a little bit overly enthusiastic about this, but I do think this ability is good enough to where it will be worth considering playing at some point in certain decks. So we'll have to see, but I think my first impression of this card is I'm cautiously optimistic. I'll say keep an eye out for it. You never know, it might surprise you, but I do like this ability, and it might be annoying enough to where it can break through into the format. So next up, guys, we have Zoroark GX, the irrefutably, hands down, best card to come out of Shining Legends. And if you've not been following this set, let's get into why this card has been receiving so much hype. So Zoroark GX, 210 hit points, Stage 1 GX, pretty standard amount of hit points, but the first thing that's really catching people's attention is this ability. So once during your turn before you attack, you may discard 1 card from your hand. If you do, draw 2 cards. Sounds pretty straightforward. So if you've been playing for a while, this actually might look very, very familiar. This is the same diving draw ability that we saw on Empoleon all the way back from Dark Explorers. And Empoleon back in its day actually did see some play. It was never quite a tier 1 deck, but there were some different variations on the deck that did pop up and perform well at certain major tournaments. And one thing that's important to note is that, Empoleon saw play in what I think is probably the most aggressive format the game has ever had, in my opinion. Back in the day, you could attack on the first turn. Pokemon Catcher was not a coin flip. It was basically the reign of giant basic EXs. Even despite being a stage 2 in that kind of format, Empoleon still saw play and still saw some success. Some decks even opted to play the Arceus engine just to get out Empoleon to make use of its ability. So this ability is very, very powerful. We've seen players play things like Oranguru and Octillery as an additional form of draw power. So even if Zoroark had no relevant attacks, I still think this would see play just for the ability alone. So before we get on to the attacks, let's see, what decks would this ability actually fit nicely in? Well, and that's, I think, any deck that benefits from discarding anything. So take the Ninetales archetype, for example. You want to get water energies in the discard to get out with Aqua Patch. So you might see something like Zoroark GX replace Octillery in those types of decks just because the ability has synergy with the overall deck as well. Similarly, you could also see this pop up in Darkrai GX archetype, since Darkrai wants to be in the discard pile, so that you can get him out with an energy card. In the expanded format, you have things like Night March and Vespiquen, which do more damage based on Pokemon being in the discard pile. And even in the expanded format in general, you have Versus Seeker in that format, which lets you get supporters out of the discard pile. So this ability is just absolutely insane. It looks very straightforward, very simple, but do not underestimate how good this ability actually is. And one thing that I do like about it better than something like Octillery or Oranguru is that you can actually get rid of cards. And that might seem bad because you're like, well, why would I want to discard cards? Especially if I'm playing a deck that doesn't directly benefit from certain cards being in the discard. Well, think about it. There's still situations like, let's say you didn't get to make use of your Bridget on the first turn. So if you have it in hand late game, it's really not a card you want to see. So Zoroark offers you an additional way of thinning out cards from your deck that you really don't want to see anymore. So that's another reason why this ability is good. Moving on to its first attack, Riot Beat, just for a DCE, 20 damage times the amount of Pokemon you have in play. So if you have a full bench, you are doing 120 damage for just a DCE, 150 if you have a choice band. Again, just for one energy attachment to hit for 120 is very solid. You're going to be two-shotting most of the stuff in the current format, and the fact that this is a colorless attack cost means that this is very splashable into a number of decks. A lot of decks in the current format use double colorless energy. Alolan Ninetales, Golisopod, Gardevoir, etc. And even the other Zoroarks that we have in format, like the one from Breakthrough, uses double colorless energy. So if you're playing the other Zoroark, you may as well play one or two of the GX as well, since you can attack with it as well. So if the ability alone wasn't reason enough to include Zoroark into a number of decks, the fact that you have such a easy attack cost to fulfill makes it just that much more splashable into a number of decks. And especially if you look at the expanded format, for example, where you have access to things like Skyfield, if you want to push your bench all the way up to 8 Pokemon, you can actually do 180 damage just for one DCE, or you could do 210 if you have a choice band on Zoroark as well. So just in both formats, Zoroark GX is just so good, and we haven't even talked about its GX move either. So it has Trickster GX for 2 Dark Energy. Choose one of your opponent's Pokemon's attacks and use it as this attack. And one thing that's important to note, it does not specify your opponent's active Pokemon. So that means you can copy attacks even from Pokemon on the bench as well. So we've seen Zoroark break in the past find some success, partially because of its foul play attack that lets it copy its opponent's moves, but even that one only lets you copy the active Pokemon's moves, not any Pokemon. So the fact that Trickster GX lets you copy anyone makes it that much better. So of course the downside to this move is that it does take specifically Dark Energy, which means you won't be able to abuse this in most decks, but nevertheless there are still some decks that you will be able to abuse this GX move. So if you have an entire deck based around your Zoroark and Zoroark GX, you will no doubt probably play a couple of Dark Energy there. If you're playing maybe like a Turbo Darkrai deck in Standard or Expanded, you know, you'll be playing a ton of Dark Energy to abuse this attack. Specifically in Expanded, Dark just has so much support to you. You have Dark Patch, you have Darkrai EX. You know, Zoroark I think will find no trouble finding a home in that format. But just overall, guys, I could go on and on. We could do an entire video just dedicated to this card alone. I definitely expect to see this pop up in a number of decks. Do not sleep on this card. Pick it up. It's going to be good. It's definitely going to make an impact on the game. So, like I said, Zoroark GX, definitely, I think, the best card to come out of Shining Legends. And the last Dark Pokemon we're going to talk about is yet another superstar of this set, and that is going to be Koopa. So it's a 120 hit point basic, and the reason we are looking at it is for its ability Bandit Guard. So prevent all effects of attacks, including damage done to this Pokemon by your opponent's GX and EX. This is great. This is fantastic. You know, historically speaking, these safeguard type of effects have always been strong abilities, even going as far back as Wobbuffet back from the Sandstorm set. All those years ago, we've had it on Sigilith from Dragons Exalted. Even the new Ninetales from Burning Shadows has the Luminous Barrier ability, which does the same thing. So these abilities have traditionally been good, and the format is just dominated by so many GXs right now that, you know, I'm sure this will find a home somewhere. And you never know, maybe this will help. Between this and Zoroark GX, maybe this will revitalize Dark into the new format. Maybe it will make Dark great again, I guess you could say. But yeah, so let's look at the attack, because it does have to have a decent attack. So for a Dark and DC, you do 80 damage. Not the greatest. It's basically the same attack that's on the Alolan Ninetales. If you do put a choice band on it, you will do 110, but this attack cost is very manageable. Basically just 2 energy attachments, a Dark and a DCE. Or, you know, since this Koopa is a basic, you can also abuse things like Max Elixir as well. So Koopa, I think, is a very, very solid card. It's very straightforward. You know, you're going to block EXs and GXs, and, you know, you're going to kind of be invulnerable while you're pinging away at them with, you know, 80 to 100 TED damage. So definitely a card I would expect to see pop up at some point. Who knows? Like I said, this might even revitalize Dark in the current standard format, but even in the extended format, also a very solid card. So up next we have yet another Shining Pokemon. This is going to be Shining Rayquaza. It's our only Dragon type in the set. So let's look at it. It has 120 hit points. Its first attack, Dragon Pulse, for 1 lightning, does 40 damage and discard the top 2 cards of your deck. This will look very similar to the old one back from Dragon Vault, I believe it is. So not the greatest attack. You know, if you do have a choice band, you do 70 damage, but a lot of the times you really just don't want to discard the top 2 cards of your deck. But you never know, like I said, there might be some situations where it's worth it. But the main attack that I guess kind of catches my eye is going to be Sky's Judgment. For a fire energy, 2 lightning, and a colorless, it does 190 damage, which is quite a bit, but you do have to discard 3 energy from this Pokemon. So that's kind of an interesting attack. You know, if you have a choice band, you're hitting for 220 with a non-EX, non-GX Pokemon. But the downside, of course, is that it has 120 hit points, and you have to discard a lot of energy attached to this guy. But you know what? Lightning, like we were saying earlier, has a ton of energy acceleration. There's that new Raikou, there's Magnezone, there's even just Max Elixirs and stuff like that. Electrode, etc. Well, Electrode I guess wouldn't work for Rayquaza, but anyways, Lightning still has a ton of acceleration, so I think it's still worth mentioning this Rayquaza, especially if you're playing like a Magnezone style deck. You can discard a bunch of energy and then immediately attach a bunch from your hand yet again. In the expanded format, I think more interestingly, we have the Electric that accelerates Lightning from the discard pile. This wouldn't be the first time a Rayquaza Electric deck has been an idea. Rayquaza Electric was debatably the best deck in format for quite a while, actually, in the 2012 format. but with the old Rayquaza EX, it involved discarding usually about 3 energy every time it attacked, and then the electrics accelerated it out of the discard pile. So this could be more of an archetype that could be discussed in the expanded format, and running the 1 fire energy really isn't a big deal either. There's still things like Smeargle as well in the format, Professor's Letter. Getting the 1 fire energy on Rayquaza usually won't be a huge issue. But I think in expanded, I'm more interested in this card. Just because if your whole deck is revolving around electrics and Rayquazas and you're only giving up 1 prize and hitting for 220 if you have choice bands, that seems, kind of enticing. So, for that reason, since I don't see it being as good in the standard format, I might say wait and see on Shining Rayquaza. Maybe mull it over in the expanded format, but it's a card we'll have to wait and see how it does. But at the time of filming, I'm cautiously optimistic about its place in the game. Going on to another Shining Pokemon that was removed from the set is going to be Shining Lugia. So yet again, this was a card that was in the Japanese Shining Legends set, but was removed from the international release to be put in one of the product boxes that will contain Shining Legends packs. So not in the actual set, but it will be released in Shining Legends products. So that's why we're still discussing it. So Shining Lugia, 130 hit point basic. Its first attack, Silver Wing, for 3 colorless energy does 60. And if your opponent's active has an ability, it does 60 more damage. Then its second attack, Arrow Force, for 4 colorless energy is 130, and you discard 1 energy from this Pokemon. Kind of interesting attacks. The one good thing Lugia has going for it is that it is an all colorless attacker, which means that it has a wide variety of options in terms of how it can be powered up. We have the Kiawe supporter. Since Lugia does require only colorless energy, we can use Kiawe to power up a Shining Lugia on the first turn of the game and start using Arrow Force on turn 2. We also have Gardevoir in the format. We have Metagross in the format. We have the new Venusaur that we just covered earlier that basically doubles any grass energies attached. So I think Shining Lugia has a lot of options. Since it is so versatile and splashable, I think this card could pop up as a potential one-of in certain decks. Silver Wing I think is a solid attack. There's a ton of Pokemon in the format that have abilities. And even Arrow Force isn't that bad as well, especially if you have something like a Venusaur in play. Just discarding, only needing 2 energies on a Lugia and discarding 1 every turn to do 130 or 160 with a choice band, or 140 if you're using Fighting Fury Belt, just makes this kind of promising. So I'm going to be a little bold, and I'm going to say Lugia is actually a pretty decent card. Like I said, I think it might pop up as a one-of in certain decks. I don't think you're going to build an entire deck around this card, but it could be a decent 1-prize attacker that you could throw into your deck to force your opponent into a 7-prize game. Alright guys, so we're going to be taking a look at the last Pokemon in the set, and that is going to be Shining Arceus, the Pokegod himself. So it's been quite some time since Arceus has actually appeared in an actual set and not just a promo card. So let's see if his return was worth the wait. So it has this ability, Mythical Protection. If this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, prevent all damage done to your bench Pokemon by attacks. So this is very similar to the Mr. Mime that we already have in play, but Mr. Mime doesn't have to be your active Pokemon. Mr. Mime can just sit on your bench. That's kind of the first, downside to this card. But you might be thinking, well, if it has to be your active Pokemon, maybe it at least is a good attacker. That way, you can still get use out of this ability. So let's look at the attack. Ultimate Arrow for 4 colorless energy. This attack does 30 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. I gotta say, guys, that is one steep attack cost. So similarly, if you look at Tapu Koko, just for 1 DCE, you do 20 to each of your opponent's Pokemon. So for 2 more energy, I don't think the 10 damage increase is really worth it, just to be honest. Not at first glance, at least. And another thing to consider is these spreading attacks are normally much better in the early game. So something like Tapu Koko, for example, on the first turn, you can attach a DC and immediately start spreading 20, Whereas something like this is going to take at the very least 2 turns to fully power up and get ready to go. So I think this attack just in general might be too slow to really get good value out of, but also it's like I said, the attack cost it's huge. And then, 4 energy is not what you really want to commit just to spread a little bit of damage. So if you look at something like Trevenant Break in the expanded format, which is very popular, just for 1 psychic energy, it spreads 3 damage counters. So, granted that's a break evolution, not a basic, but nevertheless, it's much easier to get that out and get that powered up than this. I just think this attack cost is far too great. Maybe if the damage output was 40 to each of your opponent's Pokemon, or maybe 50 or something like that, I would maybe consider it then. But even still, for 4 energy, there's lots of Pokemon in the format that can just take one-hit knockouts. So something like Tapu Bulu GX can easily knock out things in 1 hit. Similarly, Metagross, Gardevoir, etc. So unfortunately, I just think this card it just fails on every front. You can play Mr. Mime if you really want to prevent bench damage. You can play Tapu Koko, which is a much faster form of spread damage. So overall, it hurts me to say that Arceus does not get very godlike representation this time in the Pokemon card game. So unfortunately, that is the last Pokemon we are going to look at, ending things on kind of a bad note. But we still have some trainer cards and an energy to look at as well. So next up, we do have a few new trainer cards in the set, and the first one is going to be Damage Mover. So it's an item card, move 3 damage counters from one of your Pokemon to another. And at first glance, this doesn't seem that great, and well, even on the second and third glance, this still doesn't seem that great, but I think the knee-jerk reaction to this card when I first saw it was, why don't you just play Potion? You'll just heal the damage instead of move it. So I think Potion in a lot of cases just outclasses this card. But there are certain situations where you actually would prefer to move the damage. So if you're playing something like a Drampa GX deck, let's say you attach a Rainbow Energy to your Drampa to fulfill part of its attack cost. If you play Damage Mover to move that damage counter to your bench, you can then fulfill the other part of Drampa GX's attack cost that helps him do extra damage. So Drampa does more damage if your bench Pokemon have any damage counters. So that is a situation where Damage Mover would actually help in that situation. But like I said, most of the time I think Potion is just superior to this card. So, in these decks where certain Pokemon need to have damage counters on them, I think this could be an option. It is worth noting too, you can move some damage to a Pokemon and then ace roll it up back into your hand. That's a potential play as well, but I just think this card might be a little too situational to really get a lot of use out of. I might be wrong, but the only real use I can see immediately would be in Drampa GX variants. And so we also have one new supporter in the set, and that's going to be Pokemon Breeder. And unfortunately, this is not the Pokemon Breeder back from base set. This is a much worse card, I hate to say. So Pokemon Breeder, draw 2 cards, then heal 20 damage from your active Pokemon. So, we have things like Howl in the format that let you draw 3 cards. So, I see what they're trying to do here. You get to heal 20 damage, so in order to balance things out, they make you draw 1 less card. I get it. But unfortunately, not even Howl is that good in its current state, so drawing 1 less card isn't going to make me want to consider this card anymore. And that's unfortunate because Pokemon Breeder was a great card back in the day. So when I first saw the name of this card, I was ecstatic. I was like, great, we're going to get some cool evolution-based supporter or something to help out evolution decks. But unfortunately, we get this instead. There is a nice full art version in the set for collectors, but unfortunately, as far as playability goes, this is not a good card whatsoever, I hate to say. So we have one more card in the set that we're going to talk about, and it's actually going to be a new special energy. Well, I shouldn't say it's that new. It's actually a reprint of kind of an older card. I believe it first was printed back in Aquapolis, and it's kind of seen some reprinting intermittently ever since. So we have Warp Energy. It provides a colorless energy, and when you attach this card from your hand to your active Pokemon, switch that Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. So this could potentially be decent. You know, Warp Energy, like I said, is kind of an older card. It actually did see competitive play at different points, you know, during its lifespan. So you never know. Warp Energy could pop up again, especially if you are playing maybe like a Drampa GX deck, or, you know, a deck where you're playing a lot of colorless energy attackers. This could be a consideration to put in there, since it doesn't really matter the energy that you use to fulfill your attack cost anyway. Or maybe, let's say, you know, you really need a choice band on your Pokemon because it's important to hit for certain numbers to take a knockout, but you still want to be able to easily retreat. You can attach a Warp Energy instead of a Float Stone. That way you can keep your choice band. So I think Warp Energy has some potential. Off the top of my head, my first impression is I don't know what deck it fits best in. Maybe a Drampa GX variant would be my best guess. You know, just like I said, giving my first impression of the card. But definitely one I would say is good. I'll commit to it being good just because historically in the past it has seen play. So hopefully Warp Energy will hold up in today's format as well. So yeah guys, that's pretty much going to wrap up our Shining Legends set review. Just to give some final thoughts, you know, I think it's actually one of the better mini sets that we've actually had, especially when you compare it to last year's generation set, which I think was more aimed at collectors and, you know, people with nostalgia for the original Pokemon. This one, you know, still I think will appeal to collectors out there, but definitely has much more competitive value. And I guess a couple highlights from the set for me would probably be Zoroark GX. I think that goes without saying. It's definitely, I think, far and away the best card in the set. You know, like I mentioned earlier, definitely if you don't have plans to pick them up already, definitely make arrangements to do so. It's definitely going to be the big chase card from the set. So I think that card will most definitely see play. But as far as the other ones that kind of, you know, intrigue me a little bit, Raichu GX is probably my number 2 pick, just because there's so much different support for the deck idea. I feel like it'd be hard for something not to come of that card. And then I might also give a shout out to Venusaur. I always love energy acceleration cards, especially stage 2s that we can use rare candy with. So we'll definitely give some props to Venusaur as well. And so yeah, those are going to be probably my picks. What do you guys think? Did we miss anything in this set review? Let us know your thoughts below in the comments for sure. Let us know what cards that you're excited about. But definitely stay tuned. We're going to have a ton of Shining Legends coverage, or I guess as much as you can for a set this small. But we'll have some decks being posted in the coming weeks. We'll have plenty of product openings coming up, so definitely stay tuned. But as usual, feel free to like and subscribe, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons over on patreon.com. If you want to learn more about how to support us via Patreon, definitely check out the link in our description. And also, if you want to support us by picking up something from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, that would also be greatly appreciated. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.